Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here today, and apologies for the delay. My name is Mary Dorman, and on behalf of the Clinton Foundation, I would like to welcome you all to this discussion on leading community development by building community wealth as part of the Clinton Foundation series on creating an inclusive economic recovery. In this session, panelists from a wide range of sectors will tell you all what they are doing to build wealth in their communities and discuss ways in which CDFIs can help neighborhoods access the capital needed to not only build, but to maintain wealth. Please submit any questions you may have for the panelists in the chat box at any point during the conversation, and time permitting, they will be answered towards the end of the discussion. I will also put my contact information in the chat box for anyone who would like to get in touch with me or with any of the panelists after the conversation. During the next hour, our esteemed moderator, Angela Karlberg, will lead us through a discussion on CDFIs and community wealth. Angela is a leader and expert in the community wealth building space. She's the project manager for racial equity and the democratic economy at the Democracy Collaborative and specializes in facilitating conversations at the intersection of race, gender, policy, and organizational change. Before I pass the mic to Angela to moderate and introduce the rest of our panelists and the conversation, I'm going to first turn it over to Fagan Harris, President and CEO of Baltimore Core, to provide us with keynote remarks that will frame the discussion.
Hey everybody, so good to be with you. Mary, thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the entire Clinton Global Foundation for having me today, and thank you all for tuning in and for this really important conversation. I thought I would start with just kind of a few reflections on what we're seeing here in Baltimore City on the topic of wealth building in communities of color, and some of the headwinds we're facing and some of the solutions we're pioneering to tackle those and address those. None of this will be shocking, but I do think it bears repeating. So, when we think about wealth building here in Baltimore City, we tend to look at the prevailing savings rate, we look at rates of home ownership, and we look at rates of small business lending. Here in Baltimore, we're seeing where communities of color, particularly Black communities, have lower participation rates and lower average contributions and 401ks. In general, it's very hard to save when you earn less and you're managing more responsibility for your family units. And the history of things like redlining has promoted a lot of distrust with institutions, and you're seeing incredibly high rates at which Black Baltimoreans are unbanked. Nearly a quarter of the population is unbanked entirely. When you look at rates of home ownership, over a 10-year period from 2007 to 2017, you're seeing where 51% of Baltimore residents are homeowners. That's now 47% in the Black community. That number is 42%. This is in contrast to 64% of the average American. Over the same period, the number of small mortgages offered has fallen precipitously by 25% or more. So these are mortgages of $150,000 or less. This is in a city where that's roughly the average home price. Over the last 20 years in small business lending, you've seen similar contraction. Baltimore, like a lot of mid-sized city, I was just in Birmingham, and the same dynamics have played out there. You've seen the banking industry consolidate. You've seen them relocate headquarters. And while the banking industry writ large has grown in size and scale, their participation in mid-markets, particularly markets that are predominantly Black and populated by communities of color, their engagements just dropped to an incredible degree. So here in Baltimore City, we saw $450 million of lending to small businesses in 2007. You now see $307 million here in recent years. The average loan size has dropped from $192,000 to just $71,000. If the loan to deposit ratio had kind of held steady from 2007 to 2016, Baltimore would have seen almost $500 million more in loans over that period of time. This is in contrast to equity investments, which have increased fourfold from roughly 50 million in 2007 to more than 200 million here in the last couple of years. When you look at financing writ large, 60% of businesses are accessing loans, 40% are accessing equity investments. In a data set of 2,000 small businesses, only 8 actually drew from both in terms of subsidized kind of debt financing and equity investment. And so what that tells us is that you're seeing this huge bifurcation in the economy where you have hyper growth venture backed startups, and the kind of availability of equity has increased fourfold. And there's a lot of wealth creation there. And by the way, participation by Black people in those is in the single digits by percentage of workforce. And then when you look at Main Street, and in Baltimore, Main Street is 50,000 small businesses, almost 40,000 of which are sole proprietorships. At least 12,000 of those have at least one employee. So this is a major backbone of our local economy. The rate at which they're accessing debt financing, affordable capital, operating capital has just dropped dramatically. And so that's kind of the landscape, is that whether it's home ownership, savings, small business lending, you're seeing this bifurcation. You're seeing Main Street left behind, and there's a huge need to see revitalized CDFIs, huge need to tap into kind of federal programs like the SBA, which can guarantee a lot of this lending. And most of the banks here in Baltimore actually do not take advantage of that, even though the SBA will guarantee up to 85% of the losses in a lot of cases for small business lending. And so what we've done at Baltimore Core is we've done a few things. One, we operate a microfinance platform called Kiva, which has historically been an international platform that has now made this huge push to roll out domestically. And so we operated here in the Baltimore market. We've seen huge uptake there, and that has helped bank a lot of Black-owned small business. And so we're really trying to close that banking gap that we see in our communities. That's $15,000 loans, 0% interest over some payback period. A lot of interest in that program and a lot of use of that program. It's, in addition to helping these folks get banked, it's also helped repair credit scores, and it's been a safe infusion of capital for a lot of folks who have no access to capital otherwise. We're also really investing in innovative models. One I'll highlight for you is called Parity Homes. And so what Parity Homes has done, this is one of the entrepreneurs that we back at Baltimore Core, is despite the fact that we have all this available housing stock in Baltimore City, we have 15,000 vacant homes. There are very few efforts by kind of mainstream developers to go into neighborhoods and communities, buy up those homes, rehabilitate them, and then sell them to people who want to live in those neighborhoods and communities, even though there's huge demand among prospective home buyers, especially Black home buyers, to live in urban centers, to live in inner cities. And so what Parity has done is, through a combination of CDFI and grant capital, has gone in and bought entire blocks of homes, rehabilitated them, and then finds long-term renters with great kind of history of renting successfully, and brings them in and puts them on a home ownership track. And so that's had huge success. Parity's just done a $40 million tranche of home rehabilitation over on the east side of Baltimore. And I think it's a model that we will see scaled over the next several years. And so my hope is that by kind of doubling down on the CDFI strategy, bringing in kind of new solutions like microfinance, investing in new innovative models like Parity Homes, that is really thinking outside of the box and kind of changing the paradigm on home ownership, re-engaging with the federal government through like SBA guarantees and the rest, we can start to move the needle on this. But as those initial statistics indicate, we've really got to get busy, because the trend lines, whether it's savings rates, home ownership, small business lending, workforce participation, are moving profoundly in the wrong direction. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Fagan, so much for your keynote. There's so much going on and so many things that you had to offer. I'm really appreciative of mentioning the multi-tiered, multifaceted approach that requires both the collaboration and leveraging of multiple resources in order to really move the dial. So thank you for your remarks. Hello, everyone. As Mary mentioned, it is such an honor and a pleasure to be among such esteemed systems change makers. And thank you to the Clinton Foundation for supporting such important work. As Mary mentioned, I am Angela Carlberg, Project Manager for Racial Equity in the Democratic Economy. And before I begin, let me introduce you to the Democracy Collaborative and some of the wealth building work that we're undertaking. So the Democracy Collaborative is a nonprofit foundation founded in 2000 as a national leader in equitable, inclusive, and sustainable development. Our work in community wealth building encompasses a range of advisory research, policy development, and field building activities aiding on-the-ground practitioners. Our mission is to shift the prevailing paradigm of economic development and of the economy as a whole toward a new system that is place-based, inclusive, collaborative, and ecologically sustainable. By our definition, community wealth building is a systems change approach to a place-based economic development. It works to produce broadly shared economic prosperity, equity, and ecological sustainability through direct reconfiguration of our economic institutions and local economies on the basis of greater democratic ownership, worker participation, and community control. That's a mouthful. And while this makes sense for the majority of stakeholders that we've engaged, for example, our Cleveland Evergreen Cooperative and the UK's Preston model, TDC has shifted slightly in the last year or two to explicitly naming capitalism as one that is racialized. This framework has enabled us to see community wealth building as democratic and reparative. So one of the goals of our project-based work is to locate and name where power is held and wielded. Our anchors like hospitals, academic institutions, philanthropic and financial institutions have a history of upholding and benefiting from white supremacy, systematically inflicting harm on communities of color. So we make sure to not gloss over this important piece of information as a part of the reckoning process. This is incredibly important in Northern Virginia, where we're working on a place-based strategy for community wealth building. Our focus is along a Route 1 corridor, about 2 to 3 census tracts, which is located between one of the richest counties in the country, Loudoun County to the northwest, and Amazon country with their new developments to the northeast, both of which hike up the prices of affordable housing and the ability for folks to live where they work, where they might have to commute out to where those jobs are. So per Fagan's point, that bifurcation of the economy is incredibly apparent in what is the Commonwealth, but wealth is not so common. So this county has more than 1.1 million residents and over 180 different languages that are spoken. This means that there's a large community that is racially, economically, and socially diverse. So developing a sustainable process for reparative community feedback helps to inform our upward mobility strategies that include financing for small businesses and affordable housing developments. So we're working to bring traditional anchors face-to-face with community organizations that are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and non-Black people of color led or represent BIPOC constituencies. A large piece of that conversation is to have a, we could call it a come to Jesus moment between the two of them to share in what we know to be true, what assumptions each group are making, and what are the resources that exist and the practices that we uphold so that we can move toward greater racial equity, not just as outcomes, but as a practice and a way of being and doing. So thank you for entertaining me on that piece. So without further ado, I want to welcome Maurice Williams, Vice President of Economic Development, Chicago Community Loan Fund, Markia Carter, who is the Economic Development Director of the City of Cincinnati, Luis Pastor, who is the President and CEO of the Latino Community Credit Union, and Matt Dune, Founder and Executive Director for the Center on Rural Innovation. Thank you so much for joining us today. So my first question is to Maurice. The Chicago Community Loan Fund finances many projects across Chicago to revitalize neighborhoods, create a positive social impact, and build wealth. Can you tell us about some of those lending programs and what your CDFI has found to be the most successful strategy for creating community wealth?
Sure, and thank you, Angela, for having me and the Clinton Foundation, and hello to all of the other panelists. So CCLF, we have 4 sectors of lending. They include affordable housing lending, not-for-profit and community services lending, social enterprises, and commercial real estate, which we call CRE. So our lending platform has a branding initiative called Activate Retail, where we've been very successful with a strategy of helping build community wealth. Here we've created over 11.3 million square feet of commercial retail and community facility space. And that's included over $11 million of loans over the last 5 years. So that Activate Retail brand has really been able to help us kind of get the word out about the different pots of funds we have available for that particular sector. Our CRE lending, we support loans across a continuum of community development needs, including loans for pre-development activities, construction and rehab, many permanent and permanent mortgages, and equipment and working capital loans. So we're helping create wealth, community wealth in many ways by providing critical early stage capital to real estate developers of all types and experiences, startup real estate developers, equity joint venture partnerships, even public-private partnerships as well. So CCLF's lending centers around real estate in its totality, supplying long-term, low-cost, flexible financing to help bridge financing gaps and move projects forward. So we also offer hands-on technical assistance. So when we couple the financing with the technical assistance for developers, we assist them in their planning, implementation, and other projects. So this coupling allows us to help these repeat developers come back to us and work in strategic corridors and do other initiatives with public-private partnerships with the city of Chicago, for example. I usually call these activities the creation of new economic engines, new circulation of community dollars created for newly constructed or renovated activities, providing new employment opportunities for community residents. So that's what we're up to in Chicago at CCLF.
Great. Thank you so much, Maurice. Markia, Cincinnati is known for its success with community wealth building. How do you ensure that the city has a relationship with the neighborhoods it's working in and supports development projects that give the community ownership and agency over the change happening in the backyards?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Angela. Thank you for the Clinton Foundation for having me. I want to start off by saying that the city of Cincinnati, we're very intentional about how we split up our teams and our division so that each community, we have 52 neighborhoods in Cincinnati. Each one is represented by a development officer. So a development officer may have a number of neighborhoods. And what that development officer is charged with, and they're trained, is to work closely with that neighborhood to identify opportunities, assist with financing structures, and shepherd them through not only the city processes, but additional funding opportunities that might be available. Over the years, I think we have fostered really strong relationships with our Port Authority, our local CDFIs, and we have really worked hard to establish those relationships. And it goes from a conversation about a vacant building on a corner in a neighborhood to, well, what do we want to see there? Are there any businesses in the neighborhood? And so we focus and we're very intentional about how we start those communications neighborhood-led with our development officers to really focus on those projects and understand that the community has an ownership and we want to work with them through that process.
Great, thank you, Markia. The piece about intentionality and making the connection with the communities in speaking the language, a shared language, I think is incredibly helpful. And one of the things that has come up in our work in Northern Virginia is what is our entry point with communities of color on the ground, and recognizing that perhaps it's not that traditional way of being and doing, that is through procurement policies and practices, our access to banking and lending institutions, and instead looking at those giving circles or revisiting the economic sustainability structures that existed in the past, right? We have the 48-point program from the Black Panthers. And as we're talking about communities of color, Black communities in particular, community self-sufficiency is absolutely in their DNA. So thank you for mentioning that. For Luis, can you tell us more about the community that the Latino Community Credit Union works with? How do you forge ties and create trust within that community, and how does the community benefit from those efforts?
Yeah, good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. One of the ways by speaking the language, as you were saying before. We're a 20 years old organization that we're in North Carolina, in the deep South, in an area that for so many years was a black and white community. And suddenly 20 something years ago, there was immigrants start coming from the South, from Mexico, from Central America, from other continents, and start finding a space called home in North Carolina, in Durham. The problem was that the financial system was not prepared for a different community. We're not prepared for a different language. We're not prepared for different documentation or for different levels of understanding of the financial system. So all this community was excluded. Nobody was paying attention to that. And what happened when you keep your money in your pocket and in your mattress, you are a victim of attacks every single weekend. So one of the beauty of this organization was that the community organized itself. We didn't expect or wait for anybody to find a solution for us. We, as an immigrant community, as a Latino community, we decide it's our chance, it's our time to create our own solution. And we did it. With the support of many organizations, with the support of various well-established credit unions, with the support of churches and universities and hospitals, but we did it. And when I say we did it, means that the immigrant community is the owner of this organization. Now, 20 years later, we are about to open our 15th branch. We have accumulated 600 million in assets. For this community, this low income and bank immigrants, undocumented, not English speakers, illiterate, and yeah, that's true. That may describe us at some point in our lives when we began. But with the confidence that you can work with somebody that trusts in you, that gives you opportunity, now this community has retained, because wealth creation is not the important part. You just can find a good job and you just can work hard and you can work, and eventually you're gonna receive a fair compensation. It's how do you maintain these assets under your supervision? Who's gonna give you the opportunity to invest? Who's gonna give you the opportunity to buy your first home where you keep accumulating assets? Who's gonna give you the opportunity to buy? Who's gonna educate you? And who's gonna be your partner in the long term? So that's the definition. And for us, the community building need to be through finding a space for the social justice, through finding a space for immigrant rights, for economic development, and for wealth creation. And all these 4 areas are the 4 components that we find that we can contribute in the community building. Now, in the Darden Business School from the University of Virginia make a case study about us many years ago. And they compared the cities in North Carolina where we have branches and the cities that we don't have branches. And they compared that with Virginia. And they found that there was a good number of crime reduction in the cities where we have our branches. Yet giving this perception that now we have a safe place to deposit our money, that we are not walking ATMs, we don't carry our money in our pockets all the time. That's just with this simple message, we reduce the crime against our community. Crime reduction, more people buying homes, the consequence was home value increases. So the whole community benefit for that. So finding this community that really nobody was paying attention to, because nobody wanted this community, because it's the people that were the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the appealing for any financial institution. And suddenly we organize ourselves. We decide if we put our very small amount of money together, it's gonna be a not so small amount, and we can start lending between each other. So I know that we are a big group of CDFIs working here, but the model being a CDFI, but being the model of a cooperative, that in top of that, you can just pay attention to all these other aspects, which is the ownership of this equity or this wealth, the saving component, the transaction component, and the lending component is, I think that's what may really help this the creation of this community.
Yeah, thank you, Luis. I think one of the things that I'm hearing that's really important too is the narrative and reframing around how it goes beyond banked and unbanked, and it actually becomes a safety issue and an issue that extends beyond an individual who's might be experiencing, being robbed and then violence ensues, right? But this is an entire community issue, and if we were to include both the education and a financial support system, that it would alleviate and remediate some of those concerns. So thank you for raising that. Wonderful. All right, Matt. So from the rural perspective, what do you see as the biggest need in rural communities that your organization works in? And what efforts and resources do you seek to provide to fill that need and help rural communities grow their wealth?
Sure. Well, Angela, thank you for keeping us moving and with the questions to dive into these deep areas, and honored to be a part of this panel and digging into these areas. Rural America has been suffering from a dramatic economic crisis stemming mostly from the 2008 recession recovery. And after that economic hit happened, urban areas, took sometimes a little longer than others, but for the most part came roaring right back, and rural areas not so much. And to the point where, as of January of 2020, before the pandemic, a majority of rural counties had not even recovered to their pre-recession levels. When the pandemic hit, of course, it affected everyone, and urban places were impacted, but they basically fell to their pre-2008 recession level, whereas rural places hit an all-time low. And if you look at the underpinnings of why that happened, it really falls into three buckets that aren't talked about a lot. One is automation of traditional rural jobs. The second was globalization, both through policy, but also technology that allowed for supply chain to happen, not just between urban and rural parts of the United States, but with anywhere in the world, and the decline of entrepreneurship that had been taking place for the 30 years previous to that economic downfall. And what happened was, when the recession hit, automation accelerated as people were looking for cheaper ways to deliver goods and services. Globalization increased as companies were looking for lower cost labor markets anywhere in the world. And when you didn't have the farm team in rural places of small businesses, so that when through that kind of cycle, naturally there's attrition of some businesses, there weren't folks to come following through. And the result was one of the largest economic divides based on geography in our nation's history. And it's had a real impact across the board, whether it's college graduates consistently moving out, actual population decline. In fact, the first real population decline in 50 years in rural America from 2012, 13, 14, in that time period. And it has created an attrition of civic institutions like newspapers and television stations. That means there isn't as much voice, all the way through to the impacts on economic development entities, financial institutions, and the like. So we have taken this on in a very specific way, which is to try to build digital economy ecosystems in rural places, because that recovery from the 2008 recession actually represented lots and lots of jobs in our country and lots of wealth creation. The problem was they were almost exclusively in urban places where the jobs were created, and the jobs that were destroyed were in rural. And the jobs that represent a huge part of that recovery were in the digital economy, which are the benefits of automation. So what we do is capacity building with rural communities to help them build those digital economy ecosystems. It includes starting with infrastructure like broadband, which is the electricity of our time, and then continues with creating the kinds of operational components that are necessary to create a digital economy ecosystem. And that's digital economy jobs training, but it's not just that, because what it turns out is when you go and you stand up a great computer science or coding training program in a rural place without anything else, they move. And that doesn't actually get you anywhere. So you have to do the support of early stage startups. You have to make sure that you've got access to capital for those kinds of enterprises. You need to create the places and spaces to create density, even in a rural context. And you need to be growing an inclusive tech culture. And it needs to have a tech culture so that people realize that there is people who are interested in that kind of innovation around them. But you need to be inclusive so we don't make the same mistakes that Silicon Valley and Cambridge, Massachusetts made at the earlier start of this, where it was not inclusive. And they've been spending years and years trying to unravel that. We have the chance to do it right first in rural America. And then on top of it, we are very involved in more systems change efforts, not only working across this incredible network that we have of 18 communities across all 4 time zones, but to make sure that we're doing narrative shifts, that actually tech and innovation can happen in rural places, that it can include people of all different kinds of educational backgrounds and pathways to be able to participate. And the big one is that rural America is not white America. That many of our communities are more diverse than the nation as a whole, and that if we're serious about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to make sure that we are engaging and empowering BIPOC communities within rural America to be able to do that and to be able to do that in place. Mobility does not need to mean that you move from a rural place. It means that you have the opportunity to be able to be successful in those locations. So that's what we do, and those are the critical pieces that we believe is necessary to ensure that the recovery from this recession that we're facing now in the face of the pandemic is more inclusive and equitable.
Thank you, Matt. I'm glad you raised that last point there around diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially in rural America. And even to Luisa's point, right? If we think about the economic resurgence of small rural towns, especially, for example, in Southwest Minnesota, if not for immigrant communities, Latinos, El Salvadorians, even to some extent, Ethiopians, Eritreans, and the capital and wealth that they brought with them and bring to those communities is incredibly invaluable for revitalizing Main Street corridors. So it is incredibly important to be inclusive and equitable in our practices and our lending. Great. All right, so Maurice, with more than 90% of your loan applications that your CDFI receives come from startups. How do you work with startups and small businesses to help them expand and create new job opportunities in their community?
Yes, similar to Matt, we try to find as many ways to build capacity. And we generally wrap our services around a customer with our economic development, our lending, and our technical assistance teams together, because we have separate staff that run each of those departments. And they work with each startup to assess and help identify all the startup needs, including their working capital, inventory, staffing, marketing, prospecting, local hiring, and of course, their real estate needs. So as we assess these things and can identify where there's strengths or weaknesses, we then can closely work with each startup to integrate their concept and their wishes into the existing community corridors fabric. And, throughout a large city like Chicago, there's all, turf territories and guarded areas that people kind of look out for. And new startups need to understand the fabric of each community and what that corridor looks like. So they have to be introduced properly to the local alderman, for example, and what he or she is envisioning in that corridor community. The city of Chicago and all of its workforce development initiatives, all of the local block clubs and chambers of commerces that may already be there when a startup wants to kind of step into a new space and renovate it. We assist that startup in understanding how to do that and taking the natural steps. But we also encourage startups to seek out, mentorships of existing businesses that have been in communities for a long time, or similar businesses in other communities, maybe on the north side of Chicago, who may want to come to the south side of Chicago, or east or west for that matter. So that we have greater community connectivity to support all of the efforts. It's one thing to concentrate on capacity building strictly from a stick and brick or real estate standpoint, but you also got to get in the weeds on some of the social, the personal, and the community related activities too, in order for the business to thrive and really get off to the best start as possible. We try to be as wraparound as possible when it comes to the capacity building, so that they can get a good start and then create, return on investment, profit, overhead, if you will, so that they can create some wealth generating and wealth opportunities for themselves as a developer, for the business and the employees that they hire, and then naturally for the community that the startup serves. So we try to assist with all of that as a CDFI.
Thank you, Maurice. Yeah, that invite to community is important, and having that facilitated, ushered in by your community or your organization is a form of capital. It's social capital, right? And being able to leverage that. So that's a great way to build on, or a great example from what we heard earlier around Indigenous communities and how relationships are important. So that's a wonderful example of how do we see that in practice. So thank you. Markia, what are the key services and support that Cincinnati provides when partnering with community organizations to help them expand their businesses and grow their projects?
So I'll start off with the City of Cincinnati. We commissioned a disparity study back in 2014 or 2015. And not only did that disparity study teach us a lot about who we procure goods and services with, but it provided us with a lot of information about our small businesses, our minority or women-owned businesses, and the network that we have in Cincinnati, and how they engage either really, really well, or maybe not so well with the city. And so over the years, I think it has strengthened what we do here in community economic development. We have a small business team. And that small business team, even through attrition and changes with staffing, we've ensured that they have maintained a strong presence here in the department. We offer many loan products, specifically focusing on micro lending. We understand that that is most definitely a need in our neighborhoods currently. But we also, we support different initiatives, and we have really fostered strong relationships with a lot of our community organizations that focus on assisting our small, minority, and women-owned businesses. One of the things that I think we learned early on is that we are a government agency, and so there's certain limitations to what we can do and what we can't offer. And I think our strength comes with collaboration. We have a really strong relationship with our local SBA office. We help to manage and put on presentations along with them, and some of our other organizations like the Urban League and our Minority Business Assistance Center. Specifically, which is something just a really cool concept that we did probably a couple years or so ago, is that we went out into our community organizations and we said, what do you want to see? And we heard from a lot of the small businesses to say, hey, city, what about a pop-up shop? As a city, we have vacant properties that that we either own or control. We have partners within the communities that have commercial space that may be empty. And so the last few years or so, we've partnered on initiatives for pop-up shops to help support our businesses in our neighborhoods. So those are some small things that we're doing, but I think our focus has truly been on collaboration. Our relationship with our local SBA team is so valuable in what we can offer to our community organizations and our businesses. And it has really helped us remain and retain, I think, a lot of the businesses over the years that have felt that they didn't have a strong connection to the city. They needed that assistance, and we were able to provide some of those wraparound services through our partnerships.
Great. Thank you. I love the idea of a community-owned space that offers the opportunity for pop-up shops. That's a great concept and model to follow. Luis, how does the Latino Community Credit Union partner with anchor institutions to create new opportunities for your members and for the community as a whole?
Our immigrant community, as any other immigrant community before us, came here with the hearts and the minds full of dreams and their pockets empty of money. So there is a big imbalance between the capacity that we have to save money and the need that we have for investment, for loans. So for a long time since we began, we have been very appreciative of all these organizations, churches, universities, foundations, other credit unions, making deposit with us, understanding that they have a social mission to deliver, and sometimes if they are financial institutions, they don't know how to support this community. So they find us as a tool to can really lend money to organizations or to individuals that they don't know how to reach, they don't know how to serve. And from there, all these religious organizations, and if you are there listening to us right now, I want to say thank you, because you have been helping us for all these years. But as we keep growing, as our community keep evolving, as the asset accumulation as we start feeling, or we start getting older, so we start reaching the third generation, the generation of the savers. Because it's not just with the Latino community, with any other generation, when you're in your 20s, in your 30s, in your 40s, you don't have enough money. You start accumulating assets when you're in your 60s, in your 50s, when you just start, when you already has put your kids through college, and now you start thinking, well, now is when I have the lowest expenses in my life, I have the higher income. Is when you start accumulating assets. And if you come from families that you cannot transfer these assets from one, because historically these families, we never had assets to transfer to our kids. So who are the anchor institutions for us? The anchor institution, even if we're a 600 million institution, if we have 100 million in money from these institutions, we cannot forget the other 500 million. These are the really important individuals that they deposit all their life savings with us. And that may be $500, 5,000, or 500. And I think that's the real heroes of a story like ours. The individuals that really want to put all the eggs in one basket and say, I'm sure that's gonna stay there for life, because that's what I need. The anchor institution is the individual that really put all their assets to make that work for the community at large. And we cannot forget, because this is not a business of volume. This is a business of mission, of sentiment, or understanding that you're doing the right thing and you are helping with all your assets grow your neighbors.
Thank you, Luis. I'm gonna go off script kind of here and ask, I think we've alluded to it just a little bit, but I'm interested to hear from any one of you more specific examples around the role that CDFIs can play in terms of sustainability or partnerships that we should be considering to leverage for long-term success. We spent quite a bit of time talking about startups and getting folks off the ground, but what does long-term success look like, and what is the CDFI's role in that?
Well, I guess I could jump in. long-term, working in an urban setting like the city of Chicago, where we have, millions of people, there's opportunity for renovation of existing structures and then new construction. So both of those opportunities, I think, call for green building design, energy efficient construction products, from low VOC paints to furnaces and water heaters and other things of that nature that are low NOx, and so you can kind of reach energy efficiency in different ways to make the projects, the real estate, sustainable. And I think that from an affordability standpoint, naturally, the lower you can make the entry to the financing and the construction costs, the actual principal and interest that the borrower pays back, the lower you can make that, the more that can be afforded or passed along to the tenant or to the renter, so that they can remain, not necessarily cash rich, but have enough, to Luis's point, have enough left over to save or have as a legacy for their wealth building for their kids in future. So I think that the real estate kind of ties hand in hand to the finances that should tie into the long-term viability for the user or the community resident in this case.
Thank you.
Angela, I'll jump in with a little bit on a rural context. Is that CDFIs make a huge difference in rural places, and the focus has predominantly been on affordable housing, which is sometimes a little different than in urban places, figuring out how to do manufactured homes in a thoughtful way that actually has sustainability and long-term asset creation for the people who are participating in it. But more and more CDFIs have a role to play in the beautiful downtowns that are across rural America, which because of economic trends, many times got hollowed out and largely abandoned, and are now seeing the potential for a recovery. And one that actually addresses sustainability on a couple of different levels. We talk about ecosystem building all the time, because you have to create a ecosystem of participants in a digital economy, economic development system, but in all the things that then support it around it. Making sure that you've got the capacity for things like broadband, but also downtown loft apartments, which actually fill up quite quickly in rural places, even though for traditional developers in rural, they're like, well, why would we do that when there's plenty of land to develop into suburban houses? Well, it turns out people love living in a center, even if it's a community of 10,000, 20,000 residents. And so as CDFIs are starting to get more creative in how they do their lending and what a holistic project looks like, that can include loft apartments, can include co-work spaces, and then can include infrastructure like broadband, and the kinds of places and spaces that create density and those virtuous collisions that happen in an innovative community across the board. We sometimes joke that the real core to rural economic development are the 3 Bs, which are broadband, blues, and beer. And if you can bring those together, you can actually create an energy and a synergy that is inclusive, that brings creative types of all kinds together in these really interesting historic downtowns that are still very inexpensive to engage and to redevelop in a future forward kind of way.
Thank you. I'm going to remember broadband, blues, and beer as the secret sauce for downtown redevelopment. Thank you. All right, Markia, I'm wondering about the role of local governments and how advice you might have for how cities that want to replicate Cincinnati's community wealth building efforts, how might they look to infuse government dollars into locally led projects?
Well, Angela, I think it starts from the top. We have many conversations with our elected officials and how they create policy, but then also how they fund a lot of our initiatives. I am grateful that for our city, for our neighborhood projects and our community projects, we get a few $1 million every year to infuse and devote for community-based projects, which could be something as simple as a streetscape to acquisitions of buildings, major rehab or projects or design projects that we may have going on. And so I think it truly starts from that top and understanding the needs of the community. And I can say from a city perspective, we've been really grateful that we have a strong city council that's really focused on how do we support our communities. The one thing I want to highlight is that we have a nationwide program that has been recognized a few times over related to our neighborhood business districts. And it is a community-led process. And so while the government provides the funding, the process is truly graded, scored by those participants. And so we are not just leading the conversation, we want them at the table. We want them to be active participants. And then from there, it's helping them through that process. And so I think for us, it's not only being intentional about the funding, but then having programs that directly can tie those dollars. And I think we can't speak enough to a lot of our partnerships with our local CDFIs and our Port Authority that help us in some of those acquisitions to move those projects along. One of the things that we've talked about is from a CDFI standpoint is their intentionality to stay innovative, to understand that with the fabric of what we currently have and the changing environment, that innovation is key. And I think as a government, we need to appreciate and work with them on that because they provide gap financing that we cannot offer. So I think it starts from the top, but for us, it's been strategic programming to really support our communities and our neighborhood business districts.
Great, thank you for that and for that example. Luis, I think we have talked a little bit about the banked and unbanked, and I'm interested to know how does bringing the unbanked into your credit union provide long-term benefits, not only to the individual, but for the community as a whole when we're thinking about community wealth building?
Well, the first answer will be we don't make a lot of differentiation between anything and anything. We don't treat people in a way that they are in a second category. We don't, probably one of the few financial institutions that we don't provide risk-based lending. Everybody here pays the same. Everybody is the same product for everybody. And I tell you, if any other global banks give me the same rate that the CEO, probably I will take advantage of that. And that's what we do here. So I think the first thing that we need to consider dealing with the immigrant community is we need to provide a space where people can recover the dignity. They're proud of being who they are. We need to be able to name people by their name without mispronouncing the last names. We need to understand that we have two last names and that's not a problem. That's a heritage that we bring for honoring our mothers and our fathers and all of them. All these roots are there still in our families. So when you understand all these things, and you understand, we don't only serve members of the Latino community. In the last recount, we have members for 136 countries. And this is not New York, this is rural North Carolina. So we have immigrants for every single corner of the world. If we're able to provide them with what they need, if they can feel who they are, if they can be proud of, and there is no problem by bringing your family here, your kids, all these things, being banked or unbanked, it doesn't matter. Because at that point, something that we need to be honest with ourselves, the things that we do, they are not so difficult. The things that we do, they are really simple. We need to make finance something that anybody can understand. I think we share this terminology with IT people, doctors, and finance. We just create these difficult words to understand, and we feel so smart by doing things in a complicated way. What we do is really simple. If we can explain that to any rational person, they're going to understand, they're going to take advantage of that. That's our role. Anything, we need to provide plain vanilla products. We need to hire people that really loves talking to people, educating people, building community. At this point, being bank or unbanked, it doesn't matter. And I hope that all our 92,000 members, they became unbanked forever because they never need to go to a bank. They're gonna stay working for with this credit union. That's our dream. So by building community, you need to understand that the first thing that you need to provide people is the proud of being who they are and not feel different, not feel less. And in this moment, they will do anything that you ask for them. That's just considering in the year 2020, where the Latino community in North Carolina, we are the community because we are the essential workers, even we are the last one for vaccination. But the essential workers have been stay working every single day, including in this credit union. We have been able to provide more loans that we provide the previous year. And the delinquency in our community is lower than it was in December of 2019. It's not a matter of being bank or unbanked. It's a matter of ownership, of trusting the institution, of doing anything, because you know that if you pay back your loans, the opportunity will be there again to have access the moment that you need money. So I think if we demystify who are our borrowers, who are our low-income communities, and we just treat them as Mr. Jose or Miss Maria, I think the people are gonna react and gonna respond in the same way, is with respect and feeling proud of who they are.
That's a really great point, and I think it's to one of the questions that we have here in the chat box was that often it's hard for democratic models like co-ops to access funding from traditional models since ownership is so diffused, but also I'm hearing in your experience that because there are these labels that create barriers across individual communities and these arbitrary lines, that perhaps if we didn't have those lines, if we approached folks one-on-one or as humans at least, then and recognize that race is cross-cutting, right? So for in any case, it is a challenge for Latinos to gain access to the same kind of credit as our white counterparts. It does not matter whether it be banked or unbanked. So if the CDFI recognizes that part, then to your point, what does that matter? So I'm wondering for the rest of the panelists, are there other ways that CDFIs can help address the distinctions that exist across communities, whether they are superimposed or a consequence of, say, a democratic model of cooperatives?
Well, I tend to think that the CDFI industry is unique within itself, right? Where when people think about where they can get capital from, if they're banked or unbanked, they know they need to go somewhere either close by or within a social network where they can get a yes, right? So in Chicago, where you have many, many different lending options, commercial banks, governmental loans, CDFIs, et cetera, people who are banked and maybe unbanked, they tend to shop around. So in our case at CCLF, we're 30 years old this year, right? So lots of people within Chicago, even though it's a large place, they know who we are and the type of lending that we do, and that is gap financing for community real estate projects. So those resources that we try to put on the street are either referred to us, et cetera, for housing co-ops, for startup businesses, for small developers, 1 to 4 unit developers, et cetera. So we try to make sure that we are here to service anyone who's serious about transforming the community in a way that's going to be sustainable and helpful for themselves to create wealth and the surrounding, properties and businesses and residents around them. So I think our charge, over this 30 years has been to make sure we are there to always service the least of these and those that are underserved, particularly in low to moderate income communities on the south and west sides of Chicago.
Angela, in the area of infrastructure that we do work on, which is broadband, which is absolutely critical to making sure that there's a level playing field for participating in the modern economy, and actually in a pandemic, and basic education and healthcare, we have seen that the last mile is not likely to be solved by large for-profit corporations that have access to a lot of capital. And it's for the same reason that electricity didn't go to those places when it was all shareholder-owned electric companies. And so the creativity that we're seeing in rural places around cooperative models or quasi-public models, public-private partnerships is really exciting, but it takes lenders that are willing to look at those kinds of perhaps odd or complicated collaborations and be willing to make lending decisions that are about the long term. And are willing to take a little bit more risk because they know that the return is going to be enormous to their communities, to the other parts of their portfolio, whether it's housing or small businesses, because when you can have connectivity, you can then empower folks across the board. So we see a huge role for CDFIs to play, especially as the administration is talking about really doing the Marshall Plan to bring internet connectivity to all parts of the United States. But that's going to take partnering capital to be able to make that happen. And I think CDFIs, because of their experience working with nonprofits, cooperatives, new forms of public entities and the like, are in a unique position, particularly on that pre-development side. Right? It's no different than a real estate development. The highest risk capital is that work that gets you to the place where if you have a project and what that project looks like. And CDFIs have stepped up historically to be able to fill that gap and get you to that place. That's going to be the same thing for getting fiber optics into the ground, making sure there's connectivity, making sure there's the engineering studies, and that you can actually have the customer demand. So we just think that's a huge new area that CDFIs can play in.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because one of the questions that I had was around collaboration among CDFIs and how they can be working together. And it sounds like, there are a number of we call it multi-stakeholder enterprises that exist where CDFIs can come together as one entity to start working within a community for community wealth building initiatives. But the way that you discussed risk, I think, is an important part of that narrative, and being able to talk about kind of the diffuse of risk across multiple partners. And if CDFIs were able to come together and discuss what is the level of risk and can we all afford to give or take on some of that in a way that is shared, it sounds like that's a mechanism for greater accountability. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Great. I have one last question round robin to you all is, what can people listening into this call today do to support your work?
I have an easy answer. Sometimes other type of CDFIs, they just need big investments. But as a credit union, we just need for each one of us to start considering, what do we do with our money? As an individual, we can change the world. If we make that decision to deposit our money in a mission-driven organization that is going to affect the values that I have, call it environmental, call it human rights, call it economic development, wealth creation, just look for the right place to deposit your money. We are much more intentional in knowing what is the car that we drive, what is the food that we eat, where does it come from, we don't pay enough attention who is managing our money, where are we depositing our assets. If we just make this little change, we can change the world, individual after individual. That's how we can really do it. Look for the right place to accumulate your assets.
Right. And ask those questions, ask all of those questions. Great.
Angela, from a city government standpoint, participate. So one of the things that we want to see is we want to see our constituents come to us, ask us questions, understand what programs we have, not be fearful of our department. I think we can speak from any city government. There are so many resources that are here. There's so many partnerships and collaborations that we have, and it's our job to help our community organizations, our small businesses kind of work through these hurdles. And so one of the things that, you hear a little bit about is, well, no, I'm not going to go to the city, or maybe the city can't help me with that. Always look to the city as a resource. We spend a lot of time in collaborating a lot of this information and getting this information together so we can easily disseminate it to our neighborhoods and our small businesses. And so for me, it's always, I want to see people participate, reach out, send emails, call, because that is our purpose of being here and how we can help facilitate them to their end goal, be that community development, revitalization, small business assistance, making sure that those individuals know that we are here as a resource is probably the biggest thing that I can say.
Thank you, Maurice.
And Angela, yeah, in our case, as a growing CDFI, we just eclipsed 100 million in assets last year, growing very swiftly into 2021. But yeah, our goal is to really try to find more supply of capital, because we have lots of demand, use for our monies in the Chicagoland region. But if we can find more affordable capital on the front end, grant dollars and lower interest PRIs that we can put into different funds under our umbrella, we can help meet that demand even greater. So, from my perspective, it's more about the cost of funds, because we have the apparatus already in place to service the needs of a wide swatch of urban opportunities. So that will be the key for us.
I would say on our part, I think there's three ways. One is to certainly help with bringing capacity building support to micropolitan areas and rural parts of the country. We work collaboratively with governments and private funders to be able to do this kind of strategy work and with communities so that they're empowered with an actionable strategy, and then support them all the way through that process along their journey to be successful. And we have a commitment to go from the 18 we're working with now in our network to 50 in the next 3 years, because we think that will get us to a critical mass of micropolitan areas to really get that network value and get a community of communities that can rise above that. The other area is making sure that there is advocacy for rural places, making sure that we have a geographically inclusive approach, both in terms of policy and philanthropy and other things. It doesn't mean all the resources need to go there. It just needs to go there proportionally and with a strategy to make sure that everyone is able to succeed economically. And then the other is just helping with that change in how people think about rural. And understanding that there is incredible talent to be unlocked, and it's from communities of color and folks who have been left out of the traditional economic and educational trajectory, as well as others. And if we can get help with that kind of narrative change and systems change approach, we believe that there's no end to unlocking that capacity in rural America.
Great, thank you so much. Just in time to wrap. Apologies if you hear some barking in the background. Thank you so much, Maurice, Luis, Matt, and Markia for your time and energy today, and to the Clinton Foundation for making this dialogue happen, and also in your support for ensuring communities thrive. And thank you again for myself for this opportunity to weigh in and add my voice to the conversation. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mary. I believe there was 1 or 2 questions in the chat box, as well as 1 or 2 resources as well. So I can imagine that that will be collected and recirculated after this event. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much, especially to you, Angela, for moderating this discussion, and to Fagan, Maurice, Markia, Luis, and Matt for all of your time today, and to all of you guys for joining us here. As you may have heard earlier today, President Clinton announced that we are launching a new Clinton Global Initiative Action Network on inclusive economic recovery to continue having these important discussions and doing the work. We hope you all continue to engage with us as we work to create new partnerships and make a more inclusive economic recovery. If you can, I would encourage you to tune in at 4 p.m. for the breakout session focusing on providing financial services for underserved communities. And again, I would encourage all of you here to reach out to me or at this email address on your screen to have me put you in touch with any of our panelists and continue the conversation. So thank you so much and stay well.